Welcome. This is Michael Martin, and we're starting off our seminar on Valentin Tomberg's miraculous meditations on the tarot. And I'll start with the epigraphs he places before the first letter. The wind blows where it wills, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know whence it comes or whither it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. John 3:8. Into this happy night, in secret, seen of none, nor saw I aught without other light or guide, save that which in my heart did burn. St. John of the Cross, from his Spiritual Songs. So Valentin Tomberg was born in 1900. You can find this information out in a more expanded version any place on the internet, just about. Born in 1900 in Estonia. His family was, when he was very young, were all killed by the Bolsheviks. He, as a older teenager, he joined a group studying the tarot in St. Petersburg. It was a hermetic group, I guess you can call it. And eventually, he found his way into the Anthroposophical Society. But he never met Rudolf Steiner. Steiner died before Tomberg would have been able to meet him in 1925. Nevertheless, Tomberg became an extraordinarily popular lecturer in Russian anthroposophical circles, and eventually found his way into Western Europe. But in the 1930s, he was kind of run out of town by the anthroposophists for one reason or another. There are different stories of why this is. Nevertheless, he left graciously, I suppose, and this is when World War II broke out, and I think there are probably more important things to worry about than who gets to lecture at the Anthroposophical Society. And so Tomberg, he and his wife ended up in a camp for displaced persons during the war. And here he had a flirtation, I guess you could call it, with Eastern Orthodoxy, though he, from what I understand, again, details are sketchy and you don't know who's telling the truth, that he apparently disagreed with the priest in the Eastern Orthodox Church over the possibility of reincarnation, and so he decided to leave. But in this camp for displaced person, he met some Jesuits, and through them realized that the church he must enter is the Catholic Church. And he did, and he never looked back. After the war, he finished a doctorate in law, doing his dissertation on Thomas Aquinas. And after that, he eventually moved to England after the war, where he worked for the BBC, translating broadcasts out of Russia. He knew many languages. And he just, he did a 9-to-5 job. He went to work, came home, and his life was basically very simple and centered around contemplation. He took early retirement and started to write this extraordinary book. He did write a second book. It's called Covenant of the Heart in English sometimes. Other times it's called Lazarus Come Forth, which is closer to the German title. But those are his two Catholic works, and that was it. I mean, some of his anthroposophical lectures and writings eventually found their way into print in English anyway. But he kind of distanced himself from those. He didn't want to have anything to do with them. So he worked from the early 60s till shortly before his death, I think, on Meditations on the Tarot. Was not published during his lifetime. He didn't want it to be published. He wanted it to be published after his death. In 1972, a German edition came out, a French edition not too long after that. But in 1985, the English translation by Robert Powell appeared. And Robert Powell, I talked to him about this. He was in Dornach, which is in Switzerland, studying eurythmy. At the Dornach, or the Gratianum, is like the center, the educational and spiritual center of anthroposophy. And while they're studying eurythmy, Robert met people who had the French manuscript of Tomberg's book, and they decided that he was the person who should translate this book. And Robert, who was not Catholic at the time, told me that while he was translating this book, he didn't tell me what they were, but he said he had some profound inner experiences which compelled him to become a member of the Catholic Church. Maybe one day he'll tell me what that was. But nevertheless, he was responsible for this, and it appeared in print in English by Amity House, a Catholic publisher, in 1985. And I encountered it not long after it was published. And I was kind of new to anthroposophical studies. I read a couple books by Steiner, but then I saw this book in a bookstore, and I said, maybe that's the book for me. And I read it. I was kind of astounded. More than astounded, I was blown away by what appears as erudition, that this guy had read everything. But as he says, he doesn't include these references as examples of erudition for very different reasons, that he includes all these citations. And so I've had this relationship with this book now going on over 30 years, I think. And I come back to it every once in a while. I mean, it's not like I sit there studying it all the time, but every few years I come back, get my feet wet a little bit, go back again. And I thought that finally, after I did some writing on Tomberg in several of my books, I thought it was time to actually flesh this out some, and at the request of some people who wanted to take this course, I thought I would. So let's begin. Now, probably, an easy place to overlook, especially when I was 23 when I first read this book, is in the foreword, which I think at first when I read the foreword at 23, I thought it was kind of charming, dear unknown friend from beyond the grave. But over the course of the years, as I've finished my own education, became a professor, started writing philosophy and theology, I realized there's a lot in this little foreword that has really was planted a seed within me, because we'll read right here. And this is where he's talking about his inclusion of all these citations of people throughout the text. And he says, the numerous citations of ancient and modern authors, which you will find in these letters, are not due to literary considerations, nor a display of erudition. Now here's they are evocations, a word that Tomberg emphasizes, evocations of the masters of the tradition, in order that they may be present with their impulses of aspiration and their light of thought in the current of meditative thought which these letters on the 22 major arcana of the tarot represent. For these are in essence 22 spiritual exercises, by means of which you, dear unknown friend, will immerse yourself in the current of the living tradition, and thus enter into the community of spirits who have served it and who are still serving it. And he goes on, they are above all living beings. So this is important, and this has influenced my work in literary criticism. So Tomberg says here that his citation of people like Pappus or Teilhard de Chardin or whomever he's translating or citing here, that he's evoking them, he's calling them down. it's a magical act. He's calling them forth into the magic circle of this book. Because he believes this, and I believe this is true. I know this is true from experience, that when you encounter a text, that the being who wrote the text, you are encountering in consciousness, and that being in possession of that consciousness becomes present to you. They are alive in that moment. I mean, they're alive anyway, but they're present to you at that moment. And that's what Tomberg is saying here. And so, by extension, Tomberg himself is present when you study this. I remember when first time I went through this book, I didn't know anything about Valentin Tomberg, but I started dreaming about it. And then he was at a mass. He was wearing vestments. And I told somebody what was happening. He said, "You don't know anything about this guy, do you?" So he laid down the law about who Valentin Tomberg was. And I said, "Well, that's kind of interesting." But it like what happened with Robert Powell, I started having these kind of profound inner experiences. I mean, most of which I'm still working out. So here in this book, in the form of letters, Tomberg is presenting us these spiritual exercises. And he starts, of course, with the magician. Now, interesting choice to start with the magician, because sometimes when people enumerate the major arcana of the tarot, they'll start with the Fool, because the Fool is an unnumbered card. So in a way, the Fool could go anywhere, in a sense. Tomberg saves him toward the end. But we encounter the magician here, because for Tomberg, this is the place to start in the lessons the magician offers as spiritual exercise in the tradition of Christian Hermeticism. Okay. And I want you to notice his method. He starts. By giving us background information about what exactly the arcana are. Okay? What's the difference between an arcana or arcanum and a symbol and a mystery? He wants to come to terms. We call that in philosophy. He wants to come to terms about these things. And he says that the major arcana of the tarot are authentic symbols. That is, they are magic, mental, psychic, and moral operations, awakening new notions, ideas, sentiments, and aspirations, which means to say that they require an activity more profound than that of study and intellectual explanation. I mean, so many bold pronouncements here that we need to unpack, and you could take decades, as I have, to try to unpack what Tomberg is doing here. So magic, mental, psychic, and moral operations, awakening new notions, ideas, sentiments, and aspirations. Okay? Do they really do that? And you can always see if they really do this by the method that Tomberg outlines, which is a contemplative method. And this is why he starts with the magician, because the magician, for him, illustrates beautifully the art of contemplation. Right? Which he says in the next sentence. It is therefore in a state of deep contemplation, and always ever deeper, that they should be approached. Now, what do you mean by contemplation? Right? It's not thinking about things. And I think you can see this happens through Tomberg's method. So he'll start with drawing our attention to the card, the images on the card. And then his thinking will kind of expand, where he takes in all kinds of other concepts which you didn't know were lying asleep in the image. Then he pulls it back and says, now look, let's return again to the image. This is a meditative process always bringing it back. It's a breathing out and a breathing in, an expansion and a contraction. And he does it through every single of these meditative exercises. Okay, it's important to notice that. And then he points out how they're not allegories or secrets, because allegories are in fact only figurative representations of abstract notions, and secrets are only facts, procedures, practices, or whatever doctrines that one keeps to oneself for personal motive. The Arcana, he says, conceal and reveal their sense at one and the same time, according to the depth of meditation. So, you can't storm the gates of heaven. You can't do this by violence. It has to be through this method of expansion and contraction, of I would even say repeated return to this. Now I have to think that Tomberg himself, when he first encountered this kind of meditative work with the tarot in his teenage years, I'm sure he came back to it time and again, which is why he waited so long to write this book, until he was in his 60s. Because that's how long it takes. And this also fits with his ethos of, how the Hermeticist is not grasping. Who the Hermeticist acts out of service. Because otherwise, it gets, the activity gets tainted with the blood, tainted with ego, and as he says at the end of this letter, charlatanism, right? That's the danger in doing this. In fact, it's funny, yesterday, I think it was yesterday, I was looking on Instagram at what they had tagged for Christian Hermeticism or Hermeticism, and I was kind of dumbfounded because for Christian Hermeticism, there are only 8 things, and most of them had something to do with Valentin Tomberg. But if you look for the tags on Hermeticism, it was all this quasi-Masonic, esoteric diagram stuff, which, there's nothing wrong with that. But you get the sense that what's going on with that is a kind of performative, esoteric baloney in a way. You've probably, I don't know if you have met people, I have met plenty, these people who are kind of like Chris Kattan's character, Azrael, in the Saturday Night Live skits on Goth Talk, because you see these people, are they wearing capes? Do they have to have mystery all about themselves? Are they cultivating a persona? And then you think about Valentin Tomberg, who is, on the outside, especially when he's in England, was just a guy who put on a suit, went to work, translated, went home, had dinner, contemplated, which is, and look at the profundity of what he's doing. And it's not performative, and it's not to satisfy his ego so you can say, well, look at me, I'm a Hermeticist. It's something much different than that. So this is what Tomberg is, and this is what, this is, you have to say, this is why he anchors this tradition, or this tradition is anchored in tradition. Christian Hermeticism lives, according to Tomberg, as a parasite on the institutional church. It's not, as he points out in this letter, the secret church of John. Like, we have the real secrets. Like, we have the real Mass. And all those dolts who attend Mass, on a regular basis, the people who are at church all the time, they don't know. But we have the secrets. That's the wrong way to approach it. And Tomberg's absolutely right. You have a lot to learn from those little old ladies with the rosaries and the veils who put their $3 into the candle box every week when they go to Mass. There's a lot to learn from them. You know better because you know esoteric stuff. Now, And he keeps talking about these arcana as ferments or enzymes. Now, what's he mean by that? Now, I can only tell you, now that I have had this book and Valentin Tomberg in my soul space for over 30 years, that he's right. I mean, they do work as enzymes or as ferments, and they do work on awakening new notions, ideas, sentiments, and aspirations. I found this out later, more conceptually, when I started to study phenomenology and sophiology, and realized that in sophiology and phenomenology, the act of being present to something, which is a contemplative engagement with things, is what he's talking about. And that does, I just know it from experience, I don't know if I can explain it, but it does over time awaken, we can say, new capacities of imagination, of insight, of knowledge. Not that it's always helpful, because then you have to communicate with other people in it's almost like you're speaking a different language. Like Tomberg here is speaking a different language from, we could call mainstream Christianity, mainstream Catholicism. He's speaking a different language, but it's a language that is contextualized in that greater whole. At least that's how Tomberg understands it. And he also talks about this idea of initiation. Now, esoteric people, like to talk about initiation. Anthroposophists in particular, they always talk about initiation. Now, Tomberg says there is no initiator. Well, put it this way, there's one initiator, is what he says. The master, the divine master, is the initiator, Christ. You meet other people, they might know things you don't know. They might introduce you to an idea or a book, or Tomberg. Tomberg's a great example, who introduced me and probably thousands of other people to these ideas of Christian Hermeticism. But he's not an initiator. As he says, he's a fellow traveler on the journey, on the road, right? And we help each other. And I think there's a distinctly Rosicrucian element to this. And by that I mean the Rosicrucianism depicted in the 17th century documents, the Fama, the Confessio, and the Chemical Wedding, and not necessarily the later Masonically tinged Rosicrucianism. Because in that Rosicrucianism, there's the idea that you don't draw attention to yourself. You dress like everybody else in the country. It's one of the doctrines of the Rosicrucians. And you meet once a year in the house of the Holy Spirit, and you find someone who will take over your work when you leave. But other than that, you just look like everybody else. You participate in life just like everybody else. Go to the grocery store, you don't have to draw attention to yourself because of your uniqueness, because you're some kind of, you know all these things that nobody else knows because you've read whatever you've read. That's ego. That's charlatanism. Okay, it's dangerous. And Tomberg goes on again and again in this book about how dangerous that is, and how it's a real, very real danger on this path. That if you're walking this path, that's one of the things you have to be aware of. That's why Tomberg here, it's when he talks about morality, right? Steiner talks about the same thing. He talks about the vows, that unless you develop yourself morally, Steiner would say, for every one step you take in esoteric knowledge, you need to take 3 steps in morality. And a lot of people don't really pay attention to it, but this is very true. Otherwise, you're in trouble. You're asking for, look what happened to Aleister Crowley. I mean, gifted esotericist, yes. But his last words were, "I am confused." That's not the way you want to go, people. Anyway, so to return to the text, and see, I'm kind of doing what Tomberg does. He calls the major arcana of the tarot a complete, entire, invaluable school of meditation, study, and spiritual effort. A masterly school in the art of learning. The art of learning. They do not have the pretension, that is in any case somewhat puerile, of elevating, this is talking about Hermeticists, of elevating themselves above the holy faith of the faithful, or above the fruits of the admirable efforts of workers in science, or above the creations of artistic genius. Right? We're just there as a presence. We're contributing in a little tiny way, keeping something alive in the church. And he says, well, what? And this is another place where I've seen this actually work out in my life, and it had been a couple years since I'd read these letters, at least cover to cover, prior to starting this video series or this lecture series, and kind of struck that a lot of the things that Tomberg lays out here have been things I've taken up. I mean, as my own initiative in the world. And here's an example. So he's talking about how Hermeticists don't have any superiority to men of science or artists or priests or the church, the hierarchy. He says what they possess is only the communal soul of religion, science, and art. This is what the Hermeticist possesses. The communal soul of religion, science, and art. And now this is evocative of Goethe's saying that if a man possesses science and art, he has religion. But if if he has neither science nor art, give him religion. And it's an interesting notion. I mean, and that's Goethe was very, very Rosicrucian in a way, his thinking. I think this has to do with his work in phenomenology. But Tomberg points to that's where Hermeticism exists, where it lives. Now, interestingly, and I didn't know this at the time. This is long before when I first read this, long before I worked on my dissertation, and really started to know about 17th century Hermeticism and Rosicrucianism, which are topics in my book. But Henry Vaughan, for instance, the metaphysical poet, and his twin brother, the alchemist and Anglican priest Thomas Vaughan, they kind of epitomize this relationship to science and art. It's because actually Henry Vaughan, besides being a poet, was a physician, and Thomas, he was a priest and a scientist, and so they kind of exist around this idea that's it's evoked here, and this is what the center of Hermeticism is, that place where science, art, and religion, or I always say, or sophiology is this, right? I always say this, sophiology, it's my elevator conversation, is the place where science, art, and mysticism unite and become one. And that's what Hermeticism is to a degree. It's slightly different in application, I would say. Hermeticism is probably, well, it's intuitive. Sophiology is probably a little bit more intuitive and experiential, whereas Hermeticism is discovered through other means, but both through contemplation. Hermeticism it seems a little more intellectual, I say, that's the right way to put it, but that's how it seems to me. All right. Now he talks about these three elements that the magician card represents. And these are, my little notebook here, to learn concentration without effort, to transform work into play, and to make every yoke light and every burden easy. That's what he calls the practical teaching of the first letter. So it's learning concentration without effort. That's learning to contemplate. And I really don't think I learned how to contemplate till I started practicing phenomenological reduction. In phenomenological reduction, you try to be present to a phenomenon. And this is, you can even take this to the sciences. In fact, Husserl, one of the founders of phenomenology, called it the foundation of science, is that in being present to phenomenon, by not coming at them with prejudices or preconceptions of what they are, or judgments. We often see a person or see a thing, we assume we know what it is already before the person even opens his mouth. We can just judge a book by its cover. But in phenomenological reduction, you let the phenomenon speak, and you try to jettison, or at least bracket, epoche, all of those preconceptions while you let the phenomenon speak. That takes a lot of effort. And you can't do it like the first time you try to do this. This is something you have to cultivate daily, a way to do this. And this is Tomberg's approach to all these texts he reads, his approach to the cards, and his approach to Scripture. You have to be present to it. You can't assume you know it already. In fact, probably one of the more delightful experiences as a scholar for me, and like a lot of people in my generation, I had a kind of a bias against St. Paul, because people told me he was a misogynist, and he was just a hater. And so I assumed that was true without really having studied St. Paul. But then I was writing my first book, Literature and the Encounter with God in Post-Reformation England, and doing the chapter on Jane Lead, the Philadelphian. And I realized that Jane Lead was modeling her mission on that of St. Paul, and that she actually had taken on a kind of Pauline role in her work. And so, because I realized that, I had to read all of St. Paul in a kind of contemplative way. I had to listen. And it's so enjoyable, because it felt like St. Paul flowered within my soul. That I wasn't coming at him with an axe to grind. And it was liberating. For me, I bet it was liberating for him too. So that's learn to concentrate without effort. And then transform work into play. Now, he uses the example in this of a tightrope walker, right? So a tightrope walker is doing his thing. If he's thinking about what he's doing, he's going to fall. But I don't think you need such an extreme example. I mean, it doesn't have to be life or death. Think in terms of music or sports. This is something I think everybody probably has had an experience of at one time or another. Those times where time kind of disappears. So in music, for instance, musicians or actors, dancers, get this experience when they're in the zone, when they're playing. where they're not having to think about the notes they're playing, where they're just playing, where it's kind of just moving through them. And at those moments, time kind of expands, contracts. Our experience of time changes, and we don't even realize it changes. I would think it's a kairotic time. It's kairos. It's the time of now. Whereas chronological time kind of gets disrupted through that. It happens the same thing in sports. But on the other hand, whether it's in theater or music or sports, if things are going badly, then time slows down and the chronos time just feels oppressive. When's this game going to be over? Oh, I wish this would stop. So that's part of what Tomberg's talking about, not the oppressive experience, but the rejuvenating experience of having work become play, where you don't have to think about it because you've not only acquired the skills, but you've entered into a place where all of the practice that you've done all the work you've done becomes play. All the concentration becomes no concentration, becomes presence. And that's again, another important thing to cultivate. And I think the good news is, I think everybody's had that kind of experience. It's just you need to start to cultivate more of it. So, and here's what Tomberg says about that third practical aspect of this, how to make every yoke light and every burden easy. He says, on this page 11, he who finds silence in the solitude of concentration without effort is never alone. He never bears alone the weights that he has to carry. The forces of heaven, the forces from on high, are there taking part from now on. That's a bold statement. That the forces of heaven are present to you when you do this work, when you cultivate a contemplative disposition, when work becomes play through, we could say expertise, but familiarity, I don't know, habituation, living into that experience, and then heaven is present. The forces of heaven, the forces from on high, are there taking part from now on. Now, then he gets into the section on analogy and using the formula from the Emerald Table of Hermes, as above, so below. And then this is another thing that he does. He adds as above, so below, and something extra. That which was is that which will be, and that which will be is that which was, to accomplish the miracles of eternity. So, and he builds these crosses. You see, he often uses these diagrams of crosses throughout the book, which, first of all, is very Christian, right? But also, he adds something to this later in the book, in letter 19, when he's talking about the Holy Trinity. He introduces, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. He introduces the idea of the feminine Trinity, the Mother, Daughter, and the Holy Soul. He also, elsewhere, develops this prayer called the Our Mother, which is kind of the answer to the Our Father, right? So this is Tomberg's methodology, and we can say it's a methodology of Christian Hermeticism, in that it takes, and this is what he talked about, the parasitical nature of it, where it takes something from church tradition, it doesn't expand upon it, but reflects it in a sense, reflects upon it, deepens it in that way. And like he says, it's not for everybody, and you don't need it for salvation. And people who don't know it aren't our poor slobs. They, they have their task as well. They have their task as well. And then he talks about difference between a myth. He uses Cain and Abel as an example, and a symbol, and he uses the chariot of Ezekiel as an example of a symbol. Because with a myth, and you can see his appreciation of Carl Jung here, these archetypes, we can see them play out all over the place, he says, right? With Cain and Abel, brother against brother, they're worshiping the same God and come into conflict. He says, and now I don't, to think about what you think about this. When he talks about Cain and Abel, here is the world's first revolution, the archetype, Goethe's Urphanomen, of all revolutions which have taken place and which will take place in the future of humanity. For the cause of all wars and revolutions, in a word, of all violence, is always the same, the negation of hierarchy. Now, I have to think about what he means by the negation of hierarchy. But nevertheless, I do think there's much truth in what he says, that the Cain and Abel story is the archetype of all violence. It reminds me of, I don't know if you know it, René Girard, the French critic and anthropologist. His idea of mimetic violence and the mimetic rivalry, where we imitate other people's desires. And so when people, and at first this is out of a friendly competition, you could say, or admiration, but then it becomes violence, because you can't have two people being the same person in a way. So there's a rivalry is set up, and then from the rivalry comes violence. That's certainly the case in Cain and Abel. And you can see it. There's a kitty cat at the loft of the barn making some noise. But how is it negation of hierarchy? That'd be worth thinking about. Oh, it's not a kitty cat, that's a flying squirrel. And then he continues, we're talking about analogy. And think about this. So this is on page 19, almost at the end of the letter. It says, he who makes use of the method of analogy on the intellectual plane must have worked much, that is, to have worked long experience and to have accumulated the teachings which it requires, before attaining the faculty of immediate perception of analogous correspondences, before becoming a magician or a juggler who makes use of analogy of beings and of things without effort as in a game. And I think probably the paradigmatic figure for this kind of working analogy is a poet. Because poets, not every single person calls himself or herself a poet, but the true poets, the good poets. That's what they do is they create these analogies, and we can't even call them analogies like you learn in a class on poetic form, right? But they create this language that figures spiritual truth, that puts it into language. And it's based on perception. And I think you could say that this might be why Percy Shelley thought of poets as the unacknowledged legislators of the world, because, and I have to say, another part of my way into phenomenology was in my work as a poet, because when you're trying to describe things succinctly and as accurately as possible in as few words as possible. It's a concentration of words that you kind of you stumble into this realm of the spirit. And I think that Evelyn Underhill in her book Mysticism, for instance, she talks about this with poets like Henry Vaughan, like Thomas Traherne, others who kind of wander into mysticism through language. I mean, they're not really mystics, but they certainly wander in there. Hey, kitty, if that cat jumps on me, we'll have to write a poem about it. And so finally, we won't talk about his little kind of a pedantic academic discussion of different translations of the Emerald Tablet. But probably a good thing to end with is when he talks about the danger of charlatanism, and that's how he ends this chapter. And he's going to come back to it again and again. And interesting in this one, and I wonder why he set this apart as a block quote. It's not attributed to anyone, so I assume it's from Tomberg, unless it's somebody from his tarot group in St. Petersburg. I think it's him. But at the very end of the letter, page 21, here's what he says. To perceive and to know, to try and to be able to, are all different things. There are mirages above, there are mirages below. You only know that which is verified by the agreement of all forms and experience in its totality. Experience of the senses, moral experience, psychic experience, the collective experience of other seekers for the truth, and finally the experience of those whose knowing merits the title of wisdom and whose striving has been crowned by the title of saint. Academia and the church stipulate methodological and moral conditions for one who desires to progress. Carry them out strictly before and after each flight into the region beyond the domain of work and effort. If you do this, you will be a sage and a mage. If you do not do this, you will only be a charlatan. And I think that's a really good place for him to stop and for us to stop, because not to worry about being a charlatan, but he talks about the church and academia. And both of those have, I guess you could say, controls. If a person is making himself a priest, you're asking for craziness, right? I know he might be good, but you're asking for trouble because there's no one there to tell him when he's going over the edge. Similarly with academia, there are certainly problems with both church and academia in the structures, but one thing that's good is in academia, I remember telling this to my committee in my defense of my dissertation. I said, well, it's like this, the church and academia are pretty much the same, because in the church you have people around, whether it's the bishops or the seminary system, to kind of check you when you've gone you're going to a strange place where people haven't gone, and so they can say, "Danger, Will Robinson." And similarly in academia, you do the same thing. You can wander into places where you become crazy, and so that's why they kind of bring it back to the research, to the text itself. Don't go too crazy. Explore creatively, but check yourself against the tradition. The same thing in Hermeticism. Make your explanations, but come back and check what you've experienced against the tradition. That doesn't mean you burn the whole tradition down. Doesn't mean you do everything the tradition says either. But you come back and you check it against which is again a kind of expansion and contraction, right? Because if you totally expand all the time, you are going to crazy land. And if you totally contract all the time, you become a kind of narrow, rigid traditionalist. So you have to find someplace in between there, and that's what Tomberg's talking about here. And I'm not sure he was always successful in that. You can see, if you read A Covenant of the Heart, which he wrote after Vatican II, he starts to get a little reactionary, which he's not in Meditations on the Terrible. He's getting a little reactionary in Covenant of the Heart. But, you know, he was human too. We're all human. And so these are all things we all need to be aware of. And so, with that, I will leave you, dear, probably, you know, unknown but mostly known friends by now. And we'll see you next time.